Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video for my newest series, in which I cover the factions and houses of Ice and Fire Total War, War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War Attila, that overhauls it and bases it in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the A Song of Ice and Fire books. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because this mod chooses to discard the visual style of the show, it means a lot of units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see, which is something we'll touch on later down the line. In this video, I'll be breaking down the faction of the Crown Lands, specifically the sole house it has in its roster, House Baratheon of Dragonstone, looking at the history and inspiration behind the faction and its roster, before turning to its units and looking at how historically authentic the units' arms and armor are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe, and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in the very early alpha. However, even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units, and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. Looking at the Crown Lands, they're the newest region in Westeros, created in the aftermath of the Targaryen conquest of the continent, being land taken from the regions of the Riverlands and Stormlands, being placed directly under the control of the Iron Throne. This area being centered by the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, the city of King's Landing. Looking at House Baratheon of Dragonstone, it's based on the island of Dragonstone, which along with several other islands falls under the Crown Lands. Dragonstone and its castle, also called Dragonstone, being the initial home of the Targaryens before they became the rulers of the Seven Kingdoms, the island long being one of their major sources of power, and the traditional seat of the heir to the throne, at least until Robert's Rebellion. During Robert's Rebellion 15 years before the book starts, the Targaryens were overthrown by House Baratheon and forced to flee the continent. The island was captured by the younger brother of the new King Robert Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon, who was given the island to hold as his new seat of power, creating a cadet house of House Baratheon. Until the War of the Five Kings, Stannis held the island until after the death of his brother. He claimed himself king, the island allegedly being captured by forces most loyal to the Iron Throne in the most recent book. In terms of historical inspirations for the Crown Lands and House Baratheon, the closest I can think of is England after the conquest, specifically the large swaths of land that became the king's personal hunting areas known as the Royal Forests, much as how the Crown Lands became the king's personal domain, the Crown Lands even having a massive wood personally reserved for the king called the Kingswood, making the comparison more apt. Dragonstone specifically, being the traditional seat to the heir of the Iron Throne, is reminiscent of Wales, which is held by the Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne. House Baratheon of Dragonstone itself doesn't really seem to have a direct inspiration from history apart from medieval Europe in general, although the strong naval presence of the house might be an indicator of an English origin of inspiration, much in the same way that Stannis, the leader of the house, is inspired by King Richard III of England. With all that said, we'll turn to its units, beginning by looking at the generals, each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which is normally a regular unit in the roster, as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unit. That unique general for House Baratheon of Dragonstone is King Stannis Baratheon, the one true heir to the Iron Throne as far as I'm concerned, and one of my favourite characters in the series by far. While the unit is called King Stannis Baratheon, a more accurate name is Stannis and his household guards, so I'm going to refer to the unit as such. Stannis, as said before, was a younger brother to the previous King Robert, and is known far and wide as one of the greatest tacticians in Westeros, as well as having a reputation for being an incredibly stubborn man with a very legalistic attitude. As of the most recent book, rumours spread that he has died in battle, although until the Winds of Winter is released, these rumours can't be substantiated. Looking at Stannis, he rides a very heavily armoured horse, his steed having a yellow caparison, cloth covering over which the horse has very extensive barding. The horse's head is protected by a very elaborate chanfron that looks like it's straight out of the 16th century, the armour piece being adorned with a spike meant to resemble a unicorn's horns and antlers, a nod towards the ancestral sigil of House Baratheon, the stag. In conjunction with the chanfron, the horse also has a criniere, segmented plates protecting its upper neck, with mail attached to cover the vulnerable lower neck and throat. Finally, plate peytrails and flanchards protect the torso and flanks of the horse, its rear being sheathed in a croupier to keep it safe. Overall, the horse resembles those seeing service in Western armies in the 16th century, though it isn't as heavily armoured as some of the heaviest cavalry of the era who were almost completely covered in steel. Stannis himself is well armoured, wearing an open-faced bassinet to protect his head, such helmets seeing widespread use in the mid to late Middle Ages, although his is adorned with stag antlers. Although in general attachments to helmets were avoided given that they could get caught in obstructions and provided enemies a handhold from which to grab you, adornments were still seen on helmets, although mostly in jousts and sanctioned melees rather than battle. Still, it's an absolute win for accuracy to the books, where he is described as having such a helmet. For the rest of his armour, he most likely wears an arming shirt with a mailed collar providing defence for his upper throat, the bottom of the shirt probably having a mail skirt with a rider's split attached so as to protect his upper legs while on horseback. Over his arming shirt is a plate cuirass with the new sigil of his house, the crowned stag head inside a flaming heart inlaid, this being his armour as described in the books, this armour looking like that used by heavy infantry and cavalry in the 15th century. His shoulders protected by pauldrons and spolders, his elbows and forearms align large cowders and vambraces for protection, while his hands have simple leather gloves, padded pants with leather boots and pollens being his only protection for his legs and knees. Capping off his look, Stannis wears a bright red cloak over his back and wields an arming sword with a ruby in its pommel, the weapon most likely being the sword Lightbringer, forged for him by the Red Priestess Melisandre, the king seemingly choosing not to use a shield. Turning to his men, they all wear bassinets with attached stag horns, although some have visors of various kinds attached for face protection. My main issue being that some of them appear to have oculari, that is eye holes that are way too large. For the rest of their armour, they have mail standards protecting their necks, while their torsos have the same arming doublet with plate cuirass combination, their cuirass having yellow surcoats with the blazing new sigil of House Baratheon of Dragonstone adorning them. It appears you can see the underarms of these men being protected only by their arming shirt, which is a major flaw as mail should always be used to protect the parts of your body plate can't physically protect, this gap making them vulnerable to stab wounds and other attacks in that region. Unlike Stannis, these men have a mix of plate gauntlets protecting their arms, while their legs have greaves and cuisses for defence, some choosing to use sabatons while others have leather shoes. At their sides they have arming swords that look like 14th to 15th century examples, while their main weapons are historically accurate warhammers and picks, having a mix of metal and wooden shafts, these weapons seeing increasing use in the late Middle Ages for killing armoured foes, the weapons being perfect for punching through the armour of knights and man-at-arms, the back spikes being perfect for hooking foes, while the hammer and top spike allow you to get past enemy armour. Overall, great weapons to see and a definite step up from the fantasy warhammers you see in most public works, the weapons being perfect for use on horseback as well as foot. While it may seem odd that Stannis is using a weapon less effective than those of his men, Stannis is a strategist first and foremost who tends to lead tactically from the rear, not getting drawn into battles himself, so it makes sense that he be less heavily armed and armoured than his men, still capable of fighting, but not going out of his way to fight the enemy hand to hand. In conjunction with their warhammers, Stannis' guards use heater shields painted with his sigil, heater shields being used by knights as armour developed to the point that large shields were no longer needed. These heater shields are actually heart-shaped too, which is a nice touch, the shields having a bit of a rim to catch blows. As a unit, these gold tier late game heavy cavalry are perfect at smashing into enemy forces and getting stuck in. Not true shock cavalry given their lack of lances, they're still a very tough unit and one that I'd more than recommend as general when playing as this faction, especially if you want the experience of having the one true king in your army. With this unit covered, we'll get into the regular units the faction can field, beginning with the Dragonstone pikemen. Just by looking at them, it's clear these are well-armoured infantry, all in the unit wearing helmets, a mix of open bassinets with mail aventails generally attached to provide extra protection to the side of the head. For their torsos, some of the pikemen have mail shirts and pants over which they have surcoats emblazoned with Stannis' sigil, having gorgets over the top of their surcoats, which I can't accurately critique when it comes to historical accuracy, as typically gorgets were worn with plate armour to protect the neck, normally underneath the top of the cuirass rather than over it. However, given these troops don't have plate cuirasses, it might just be a case of men making the most of what armour they have available. Apart from that, many other men in the unit just wear gambeson with a mail shirt underneath to protect their torsos, while others wear gambeson, mail, and then brigandine over the top to finish it off, some in the unit even having placards, the lower plate component which protects your stomach in a full harness, over the top of their brigandine, making for them very well armoured for lesser infantry. For their arms, men rely on a mix of mail sleeves, brigandine pauldrons, plate spolders, and rear braces as gambeson, some in the unit having cowders to protect their elbows, while almost all have vambraces, some men relying on leather gloves to protect their hands, while others wear articulated plate gauntlets. Finally, their legs are lightly armoured, all wearing leather boots, while some have pollens to protect their knees. For their main weapon, the troops use pikes with a leaf-shaped head, the shaft being reinforced with metal bands to provide support. Despite their lacking of shields, these men are fairly well armoured and very representative of the bulk of infantry in the late 15th and 16th century in Western Europe, these men not looking out of place in a Lancastrian or Yorkist army in the English War of the Roses. I very much applaud the mod creators for their work making the aesthetic of this faction. Turning to the unit officer, he is more ornately armoured than his men, wearing a bassinet with a partially gilded visor, the helmet being topped with the stag horns of House Baratheon. For his chest, the officer wears an arming shirt with attached mail sleeves and skirt, although the skirt has a rider's split, which doesn't make sense for a dedicated infantry. Over the top of the shirt being a plate cuirass covered with a Baratheon decorated surcoat. Protecting his shoulders, his gilded pauldrons would look like they came out of the 16th century, while the rest of his arms were lined with rondels, spaulders, van braces, and highly gilded and enamelled articulated gauntlets for safety, the gauntlets with their gilded cuff being reminiscent of the armour of Henry VIII. Looking at his lower half, his legs are protected by black steel cuisses, pollens, and greaves, all being partially gilded, although his feet seem to only have mail shoes on. In terms of equipment, the officer relies on a smaller kite shield in the shape of a heart, the stag and the fiery heart emblem being proudly worn on this shield. A warhammer like those used by Stannis' household guard being used in combination with the shield. As a unit, these silver tier 2 pikemen are a mid-game staple of the Baratheon forces, being perfect at fending off cavalry and infantry, although skirmishes are a danger, as is being flanked. That said, on the open battlefield, this unit will be a wonderful mobile fortress around which to base some movements, being even better when on the defensive in sieges, where they make chokeholds almost impregnable. Overall, a very useful and very historically authentic unit. Moving on, we come to the Dragonstone crossbowmen, who are armoured very similarly to the previous unit, the main difference being that no man in this unit has any arm protection apart from leather gloves and gambeson sleeves, in comparison to the varying plate armour of the pikemen, although it should be said the crossbowmen are more armoured when it comes to their legs, many having pollens and all having greaves, some being more basic leather reinforced with plate strips, but even so, the crossbowmen have good leg protection. Much like the previous unit, these guys lack shields, but have at their sides what look to be daggers and short swords in case of melee. Some of the weapons potentially being falchions and similar weapons, more basic swords which saw service with lower class infantry. For their main weapon, however, the men have crossbows, this being one of the most ubiquitous weapons of medieval Europe due to the easiness and speed in training someone to be proficient with one, especially in comparison to a longbow, which were these outranged even if they were slower, crossbows being prized for their compactness, especially in sieges where they were often used by the defender. Looking at the officer, he's identical to the previous one, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit role. These tier 2 silver tier men are quite valuable in the battlefield, where they provide your armies with ranged support, being a significant part of your range strength and more or less equal to the opposition they're expected to face. While a good unit, it's important to note that crossbows are better served shooting straight rather than at angles, so against archers, especially archers behind a wall or protected by a ledge, this unit can struggle, so always make finding clear lanes of fire a priority when fielding these guys. Overall, a unit that will be seeing a lot of service, especially if you want to contest the enemy in a shooting match before the melee begins. Moving on to the next unit, we have their bow equivalent, the Dragonstone Archers. Armoured and armed identically to the previous unit, these men are differentiated by their weapon of choice, the longbow. Longbows saw widespread use in the English armies of the 14th to 16th century, as well as in the armies of Burgundy and partially France in the form of the Scots Guard, the sheer rate of fire for longbows making them a very viable alternative to crossbows even if they were somewhat lacking in range and power. Much like the pikemen and crossbowmen, you could put this unit in any battle of the War of the Roses and it wouldn't look out of place. Skipping the officer as a unit, these guys are another choice you have available to you when it comes to range strength. These tier 2 silver tier bowmen being just as dangerous if not more so than the crossbowmen, given that they can more easily shoot over walls and fortifications onto the enemy. Personally, I'd recommend a mix of the two in your army when it comes to your ranged arm, each complementing the other well. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Dragonstone Men-at-Arms. Armoured identically to the Dragonstone Pikemen, these troops are distinguished by their large heater shields, the same type as the one used by Stannis and his household guards, the shields being used in conjunction with arming swords that look like they're straight out of the 15th century. The shields make sense for troops armoured like these, given lighter armed troops continue to carry shields with them into combat into the 16th century. Arming swords also seen common use during the late Middle Ages, although it would be nice to see these men equipped with maces and axes, as well as the swords. The troops looking like they'd find service in most Western European armies of the 15th century, skipping their officer who we've seen before. Apart from their equipment, the only issue I have with this unit is its name, as men-at-arms refer to heavy cavalry of the late Middle Ages, not more basic infantry. However, it's long been a trend to refer to such troops as men-at-arms, including in the A Song of Ice and Fire books, so it's accurate to the mod's lore to call them that, even if it's wrong historically. As a unit, these silver tier 2 medium melee infantry are your standard soldiers and will make up the core of your army when on the offensive, especially in sieges, the unit being an all-around capable one, although care should be taken of sending them against shot cavalry or infantry. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Dragonstone Spear Sergeants, who are armoured identically to the previous unit and use the same shield. The main difference between the two units being their weapons. Instead of swords, these men use a mix of spears, some having a more diamond shape while others have a straighter tip, some spears having the Baratheon pennant hanging from them. Spears were the most commonly used weapon historically and saw widespread use in medieval armies, so it makes sense to see them being used here. Derived from the word servant, sergeants historically were as high ranked as men of non-noble birth could go in armies without receiving knighthoods, sergeants being the professional troops of the era. Skipping the standard unit officer, these men are your standard silver tier 2 spear infantry who excel at defense, able to take up spear lines to ward off attacking cavalry, the unit being a counter to heavy horse. Best used to stiffen up the flanks of your army to prevent them from being rolled up. This unit works well in combination with pikemen, allowing the pikes to plough a path through enemy infantry while these guys stop them being flanked, the unit being great at holding choke points and sieges too. Overall a unit that will be the core of your army more or less. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Dragonstone Outriders. Looking at the men who ride unarmoured horses, these men are for all intents and purposes the Dragonstone men-at-arms on horseback, the officer being armoured like the previous ones but using a lance in conjunction with his shield. Outriders in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe typically means lightly armoured scouts who go ahead of your army. These men, however, being fairly well armoured cavalry, with not as heavily equipped as knights, would be better served being called men-at-arms. That's one thing I think this mod can improve on, is having the names of units reflect their role and equipment. It's something you'll see in future rosters coming up, but when free riders, which are mercenary scouts and light cavalry, are being placed as heavy cavalry, the equivalent of nobility in the mod, something's gone wrong. That I'd say is somewhere where I really hope the mod improves upon, and I'd be more than willing to help the modders with that if they're agreeable to such an idea. My rant aside, we'll get back to the unit. Overall, these guys are your melee cavalry who offer support to the spear tip of your army, which is your heavy cavalry. These guys not being as great on the charge, but being better able to handle extended melees with the enemy, being great specifically at keeping your ranged forces safe by intercepting enemy shot cavalry and swarming them. After the enemy cavalry is broken, these guys are free to wreak havoc on the enemy rear. Overall, I suggest including a couple of these guys in your army if fighting on the open battlefield, as they give you mobility and striking power that will always be appreciated. Turning to the next unit in the roster, we have the ubiquitous catapults, crewed by men wearing the same armour we've seen before, using the same short swords and falchions as the archers, which makes sense given these are auxiliary troops who aren't meant to see frontline service. As a unit, the catapults are a critical part of your roster, being required in sieges both when on their defensive for counter battery fire and when attacking, as a way to kill defenders and punch holes in enemy fortifications. Even in open battles, these can be useful so long as you make sure to keep them protected. A lack of this unit in your roster making sieges almost impossible to carry out effectively. On the whole, I'd say one of the most useful units in the faction roster that gets overlooked. With the catapults looked at, we'll turn to the next unit, the R'hllor Lightbringers. R'hllor, known as the Lord of Light, is a new god to Westeros, who is most prominently supported by some of the supporters of Stannis Baratheon due to his alliance with the Red Priestess Melisandre. It then follows that these men are religious devotees of her who have picked up the bow. Looking at their armour, these men are mostly equipped like the Dragonstone archers, though it appears all the men in the unit have abandoned brigandine and instead wear mail shirts with gambeson over the top. An odd choice to be sure, and one I can't explain. Hopefully you guys can give me clarification in the comments. All the men in the unit wear bassinets for head protection, although some of the men have the stag horns mounted on their helmets, such adornments not being the most historical of concepts, at least on the open battlefield. Protecting their shoulders, the men wear a gorget with attached pauldrons, spolders covering the upper arms while vambraces keep the forearms safe. I'm not too sure in this case if such large pauldrons would be functional, as I'm not certain if you could loose arrows or if your shoulders would get stuck trying to shoot. Rounding off their armour, all the men have greaves of varying kinds and some have pollens for their knees, a short sword at their side in case of combat, and a metal-tipped longbow as their main weapons. Longbows saw widespread use as I touched on before, especially in the British Isles, so seeing them in the hands of these men makes sense, especially when a lot of royal retinues had elite archers providing them fire support. Skipping the standard officer, these silver tier 2 light archers are a step up from the Dragonstone archers in terms of range skill and damage, although if I'm being honest, you can afford not to field these guys as they're not offering that great of an advantage over the standard archers and crossbowmen. I'd only really use them if you're going full in on an archer army build and want the best possible, but generally, I'd avoid these guys. Moving on to the next unit, we find the Kingsmen. Stannis Baratheon's court is split into two main groups, the Queensmen, who are the religious supporters of R'hllor, who side with the Queen and the Red Priestess, and the Kingsmen, supporters of Stannis who stick to the established religions of Westeros and who back the king more than his wife. This unit signifies those men. Very heavily armoured infantry, these men are almost identical to the unit officers, except these men don't have gilded pauldrons or gauntlets, some choosing not to wear visors and keep their face exposed, some choosing to have stag horns attached to their helmets, or choosing to discard maces and shields, instead choosing to use massive two-handed swords, which instantly bring to mind the Zweihanders of the 16th century. Giant swords used in the German states, most prominently by the Landsknecht mercenaries, such swords being more akin to a polearm than a sword, perfect at smashing through enemy formations. The only way this sword could potentially benefit the unit was if it was a flamberge, giant swords with blades shaped to look like flame, weapons that more than fit the motif of Stannis with his flaming symbol. The swords that these men wield make a lot of sense, given that they're that heavily armoured that they can drop shields and instead rely on their armour to protect them, dealing out exponentially more damage with a two-handed weapon than they could with a one-handed one. Skipping their officer, these gold tier 3 very heavy shock infantry are the perfect spear tip of your army when on the offensive, excelling at cutting a bloody path through enemy infantry. We should try and keep them away from enemy archers and shock cavalry as they're vulnerable to them due to their lack of shields and anti-cavalry weapons. As a mobile reserve to take advantage of weak points in enemy lines, these guys are great. As good as they are in open battles, it's in sieges that these guys shine, as when on the offensive they can clear enemy strong points, opening up paths for the rest of your army. When on the defensive, they can be that extra bit of muscle that carves up overextended enemy attackers. Overall, a great unit, and one that I expect to see in any Baratheon army of the Crown Lands, although more so in late game elite armies. Moving on to their counterpart in the court of Dragonstone, we have the Queensmen, heavily armoured infantry that are equipped almost identically to Stannis himself when it comes to armour, having the same plate cuirasses with engraved and enamelled symbols of the flaming stag. These men, however, wearing a mix of bassinets with and without visors, some having stag horns and others lacking them, all however having articulated gauntlets over leather gloves, something that Stannis himself lacks. Using the same kite shield seen before, these men use them in conjunction with a nasty assortment of flanged maces, weapons from the 15th century perfect for killing armoured foes. The weapons and the men looking like knights and men-at-arms of the early 15th century, though their helmets are a bit older styled. The shields make sense in this case in spite of their armour, and these men know the danger of weapons like maces and thus use shields to put one extra barrier between them and the enemies wielding such weapons. Skipping their warhammer wielding officer, these gold tier 3 very heavy infantry are a balance between shock infantry and line swordsmen, able to deal out greater damage than the regular infantry but not as much as shock infantry, the troops also being better defended and more resilient to enemy attacks than shock infantry, being better suited to hold a defensive line than shock infantry. Because of this, I say it's a good idea to mix and match these guys and the Kingsmen, each covering the other's weakness, which I'm sure is an intentional design by the mod creators to reflect how Stannis' court functions. Overall, a nasty reserve unit that you wouldn't want smashing into your lines after a drawn out fight. Turning to the next unit, we finally reach the heavy cavalry of the faction, starting with the Lord's Chosen. As the name suggests, these are religious followers of the Lord of Light, riding heavily armoured horses as well equipped as those ridden by the household guard of Stannis. Chanfrons, patrons, criniers, croupiers and flanchars all being worn over the yellow caparisons, keeping the neck, head, chest and rear safe. The riders wear the same mix of bassinets we've seen before with mail coifs underneath for added protection, arming shirts with mail sleeves protecting their torso, over which they have plate cuirasses, covered with surcoats emblazoned with the flaming stag over them. All in the units have pauldrons, although some choose to wear gorgets and spolders, the same occurring with cowders to protect the elbows. All, however, have van braces and articulated gauntlets, some having folds attached to their arming shirts for their upper legs, the unit uniformly having completely armoured legs, cuisses protecting their thighs, while greaves, pollens and sabatons keep their shins, knees and feet safe. Apart from their armour, these men have heater shields to protect them and have arming swords that wouldn't look out of place in the 13th century at their side, although it should be noted that when dismounted, the men in the unit have the swords at their side and another one in their hands, meaning they have two swords in addition to their lances. Their dismounted arming swords being of a different style, looking more like ones from the 15th century, an odd thing to notice. When on horseback, their main weapon is of course the lance, many bearing pennants with Stannis' sigil, the lance being perfect on the charge for smashing into enemy hosts, the weapon being the evolution of spears used by mounted men. Skipping the standard officer, these gold tier 3 very heavy shock cavalry are the iron fist of your army, being the unit that best combines mobility with devastating power on the open battlefield. Best suited for breaking weakened enemy lines or hitting units from the rear, I keep these men away from spearmen and archers as both pose a threat, pikemen even more so being a massive threat if faced head on. Melee cavalry too is something to watch out for. They can better endure sustained combat, these may be suited for cycle charges, continuously applying force rather than petering out and getting stuck into a slogfest. Definitely a unit I suggest including in your armies, although be smart about how you use them, as they aren't a unit you can easily make up for once they're lost. Moving on to the final unit the faction can field, we have the Champions of the Stag, a heavy cavalry unit that can also double as faction general if you don't want to field Stannis as your commander and want a more general. Both riding identically armoured horses and being identically armoured to the previous unit, these men are distinguished by the weapons they use in conjunction with their heater shields, war hammers, Bector carbines, and war picks, all these weapons being suited to killing armoured foes. Skipping the officer wielding a lance with an attached pennant, these men are gold tier 3 very heavy melee cavalry who excel at getting stuck into the enemy, be they infantry or cavalry, particularly shock cavalry, who they're great at killing once they've caught them and gotten stuck into, their weapons making short work of them. While obviously not as devastating on the charger's dedicated shock cavalry, these men can still do a lot of damage, especially when after clearing the battlefield of opposing cavalry, they can get stuck into the enemy infantry from the rear and flanks and run amok. A useful unit, both for its intended role in the battlefield and ability to serve as general, I say mixing a few of them into your army build is a good way of ensuring your army has a bit more mounted muscle than expected. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Baratheon of Dragonstone, of the Crown Lands, are a faction that have a small but balanced roster, reflecting the fact that the house has a relatively small pool of manpower to draw upon. While they currently lack a specialisation and are more or less a jack of all trades, that might be subject to change in the future, as the faction is well known for its naval power, so it might be a case of when ships are added to the mod, this house might be significantly more powerful than its competitors. I'd say for now a more basic army build is the best way to go with the faction, instead of leaning heavily on cavalry, archers or infantry individually. Overall, I'd say these guys are a very straightforward faction, who due to my personal opinions on the books, and appreciation for more standard factions, are my favourite faction in the mod currently, but who I can't wait to see be expanded upon in the future. Hopefully I've kept my bias in favour of this faction in check. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured, more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.